You know, AirPods always had a good click, but when you put this Nomad case on, it gets a little heavier. Whoo, it's a good click. Anyways, today we're talking Sony a7S III and SLOG3 specifically, and my current process for in-camera settings all the way through the color grading process in Premiere Pro. Yes, using Premiere Pro today, but you can use any editing software and get a similar result with this process. So let's get into it. Now, I am still fairly new in this YouTube environment, but not new to filmmaking, and in some of the groups that I'm in, I've been asked, how are you getting that look? So this video specifically is showing all of you who asked how to get this look. The one you're looking at right now, this is what I've worked really hard to get. It took me a couple months of working with the a7S III, maybe a month and a half, I don't know. Going from the a7 III, where I was shooting a lot of SLOG2, was liking the style that I was getting, and then getting into this a7S III with 10-bit color and starting to shoot SLOG3. Took me a while to get this exact look that you're seeing dialed in. So this is the whole process that we're going to be going through today. Now, why would somebody even want to shoot in log format? Well, it preserves a lot of dynamic range, which we've all associated with that more cinematic look. And I think learning how to shoot log, though it is tricky and a bit complex, learning how to shoot with log, I think the results are very worth it. I am not a professional colorist. You might be, some of you who maybe are professional colorists who are looking at this video are going, yeah, duh. So I'm not a professional colorist. And though I am newer to YouTube, I think this is my 4th video on YouTube, I'm not new to shooting video. I've been shooting semi-professionally for a couple of years now, which really in the grand scheme isn't that much time at all. So I'm sure I'll look back on this hopefully in a few years and go, that looked horrible. And hopefully that's because I learned a ton from all of you and got significantly better. But even though I'm not a professional colorist, I'm happy with the results that I'm getting, and I'm looking forward to showing all of you exactly how I'm doing that. And as I mentioned, this is going to be specific to the Sony a7S III and SLOG3, but a couple shots actually coming up, I'm going to be shooting with the a7 III with SLOG2. I know that the a7 III and the a6000 series cameras like the a6400, these have the ability to shoot SLOG3. I don't recommend you do that. It tends to fall apart with that 8-bit color depth. So I encourage you with that a7 III, a6000 series, a7R series, shoot an SLOG2, and the principles I'm about to show you are going to be very, very similar, minus a couple of small tweaks, which I'll be sure to show you. We're breaking this video down into 2 very simple sections. The first one being the exact in-camera settings that I'm using, because if you don't get it right in camera from an exposure and white balance perspective, it's going to be really hard to like your result when you get into post-processing, which is the second thing that we're going to be getting into today. The second category is going to be post-processing, color grading, color correcting in Premiere Pro. And before we dive into the a7S III in-camera settings, I'm not going to be getting into the codecs that I shoot in, like the 420 10-bit in HS, for example, which is the one that I do prefer for the record. I'm not going to get into the codecs, and although the codecs are a very important aspect, that's a whole separate video, which I will be doing. I think I have found a really nice codec that preserves a ton of the quality that the a7S III is capable of, but also is editable on what I have is it's a pretty spec'd out 2019 MacBook Pro. I have heard that depending on the codec that you're shooting in, sometimes the footage can be near impossible to edit depending upon the machine you're running. Regardless, I will be shooting a video in the very near future about the exact codec that I'm using in my workflows with my 19 MacBook Pro, and I think I've found that really nice balance between high quality and editable files. So if that's something that you might be looking forward to, hit that subscribe button down below, tap the bell so that you know when I post that, so you can be one of the first ones to check it out. I think it could help you a lot. And I'm clearly using audio right now on the Rode NT1, one of my favorite microphones for audio. I would typically like to overhead this scene, but my new overhead microphone is arriving today. I got the Rode NTG5. I was trying to boom the video mic NTG and just wasn't getting the results that I wanted. So actually, what I'm going to switch over into shooting into the a7S III, and we're actually going to switch microphones as well and shoot that NTG5. So if you're curious about NT1 versus NTG5, we're going to do that audio comparison. It's be a light comparison because I don't think anybody's actually looking for a comparison like that. Two very different microphones. But anyways, we're going to do it because I'm going to almost do it by accident. So see you over there. Alright, so here we are in the A7S III. We're going to take a look at two things that we have to get right in camera so we have a good shot to get a consistent look when we get it into post. First thing is going to be our picture profiles. I've navigated my picture profiles just by tapping down on my wheel. So here we are in picture profiles. I've chosen picture profile 2. You can choose any one that you want as long as you go down to reset and hit enter and reset all of these settings. From there, you're gonna change just a couple of things. Leave black level alone. You're gonna obviously go into gamma and choose SLOG3. Leave black gamma alone, leave knee alone. Color mode, very important here. You'll see why when we get into post. S gamma 3 cine. Saturation, I leave alone. Color phase, I leave alone. Color depth, I leave alone. And detail, I used to bring this down to -7 because I had thought that in-camera sharpening, which is what detail is no good and it adds noise to your image, and then you would just go into post and you would sharpen from there and you'd get a better image. I did that for a couple of years and I've recently found that just shooting with a detail of 0 tends to make the most sense, and my footage, whether it's in slow motion or in 24p, looks really good and I don't have to worry about doing anything in post in the way of sharpening. And one quick thing, if you are shooting with an A7 III or an A6000 camera or an A7R, I don't recommend using SLOG3. Instead, everything we just talked about would be the same, besides you're gonna shoot SLOG2 and you're just gonna choose S gamut as opposed to S gamut 3 cine, and you'll see what I mean when we get into post with that. In fact, the shot you're looking at right now is being shot on the A7 III and SLOG2 with our regular S gamut. Alright, so the next thing we're going to want to get right in camera is going to be white balance and exposure. Let's go through exposure first and we'll go to white balance from there. So first thing, I've put my zebra levels in my function menu. So if I access those, I keep my zebra levels at 90, and then my center button of my wheel, this toggles my zebras on and off. So let's put those on, and all that I do is I just expose my subject. In this case it's going to be that aperture MC light. I just expose my subject with my zebras. So after we get our zebras set, the first thing we want to do is lock off our shutter. So I'm shooting 24p in this case, so my shutter is almost always going to be double my frame rate. Again, frame rate here is 24p. If I was shooting a slow motion clip that was at 120 frames a second or 120p, my shutter would be as close to double as possible, and on the A7S III and most mirrorless cameras that would be a 1/250. So almost always double the frame rate is what my shutter is going to be. Next, f2.8. This is a 2.8 lens, and if I wanted more things in focus, I would bring that up. But let's just say that I want as much out of focus elements as possible in this shot. I would lock off my aperture at f2.8 in this case. Now, this is where the zebras are important. I'm just going to use my ISO, which I've customized to be on my wheel here. I'm just going to use bringing up my ISO to expose for my subject, in this case that subject being that aperture MC light. I'm going to bring my ISO up until we start to see the zebras, which we can see them kicking in on some of these highlights on this very light colored felt on the desk. That makes sense. I'm not worried about that. I want to make sure I'm getting zebras on my subject, which I'm starting to get them now on that lighter colored logo. But just to make sure, like you'll see that those zebras will barely start kicking in on that logo right about here at ISO 2000. I would in this case bring it up a little bit higher just to make sure that I have it on those blacks on the subject as well. So once I'm good with that, I would toggle off my zebras because I know I have the exposure that I want, and those zebras can be a little bit annoying. One more thing, I have customized my C4 button here, this trash button, to be my gamma assist. So it just automatically toggles it on, and then it is set to auto, so it knows I'm shooting in SLOG3, and it shows me what the image would look more like if it was graded as opposed to what it's going to look like straight out of camera. After exposure set, we got to take care of white balance. If we don't get our white balance squared away, it's going to be really hard to get it to look right. In post, that's a lesson that I learned very early on with all this, is you gotta nail your white balance. So what I've done, my C1 button is customized to my white balance. And there's really 3 situations that I'll be shooting in from a white balance perspective. I just set it to auto, and this is a situation where I'll leave it in auto if it's like a vlog style where the scene is changing and I need the white balance to change. Nice thing about the A7S III is we don't want our white balance to shift too fast in an instance like that. What they've done in here on the video tab, if you go to white balance and you go to shockless white balance, you can choose how fast you want the auto white balance to calibrate new colors and how fast you want it to change those colors. And I have this almost always set to slow. So if I'm in an auto white balance scenario, it's because I want there to be some color shift because I'm in a changing scene. More likely is I'm shooting in a non-changing scene and I need to lock off my white balance. In this case, I will just go to the Kelvin selector, and I have my key light is a 5600 Kelvin light, so I would lock this white balance off at 5600, which is replaced where the AWB for auto white balance used to be. And the last situation I might be in is, let's say I don't know what the white balance is of my key light, and I need to go and get that set because I want to lock it off because I don't want the colors to shift. 2 options. You can do a custom set using a gray card, or something I started doing a lot recently. I'll actually go back into white balance, give the camera a couple seconds to get the scene, and I've customized my AEL button here. I'm just going to tap that. And what you might notice on the bottom right is I tap this AWBL comes on. What that's doing is it's locking the white balance when that AWBL is visible. So I'll let the camera calibrate for a little bit with the AWBL with the lock turned off. I'll let the camera calibrate the scene, I'll lock it off, and I'll shoot from there. All right, last section, we're gonna jump into Premiere and get a look at this footage and start to get our color grade going. Yes, I changed. Well, different day. These videos take a long time. Also, NTG5 taking the audio. And I was actually taking the audio when we were looking at those in-camera settings as well. So hopefully you didn't notice a difference between the NTG1 and the NTG5, both super high quality microphones. I'm extremely happy with this NTG5 so far. All right, we're about to jump into Premiere and take a look at this footage. But again, if you're using a different software like DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut, a lot of what I'm gonna review is still gonna work. It's just gonna be a bit of a different process. So, Premiere. All right, so this is the clip from earlier. This is the raw version, and we have the edited version over here. So we're gonna work backwards to get that. So raw clip here, and we're also gonna be working with this clip of a barbell collar, some fitness gear. This shot looks really nice when it's graded. We are editing on a 24p timeline, so a bonus tip here. This is 120 frames a second clearly. How I get my 120 frames a second footage down to 24p, I right click, go to modify, interpret footage. From there we're going to go assume this frame rate 23.976 is our, that's not what you want, that's not going to do anything good. There you go, 23.976, and now all of a sudden that is a slow motion clip. And let's get our in and out points of this clip, and I like that little bit of a little micro parallax there, so we're going to start that here. And it's gonna probably finish right about there where I get the wobbles, and we're gonna bring that clip in. All right, so we got these 2 clips. We have our talking head interview style clip, and then we have our fitness equipment one. This one, very skin tone dominant. We gotta get the skin tones just right. And our second clip, having no skin tones at all, we don't have to worry too much about that. So here is my process. First thing I do is I'm gonna go into the color panel, and I'm going to apply a LUT. This is my color correction LUT. I use the Leeming LUT 1. Link's gonna be in the description. I have zero affiliation with these Leeming LUTs, but I do think they're the best ones that I've used to get my log footage back to something that looks normal. And you see that S-Gamut3 Cine. That's why when we put it in the picture profile on the camera, we chose S-Gamut3 Cine, and for SLOG3, we chose S-Gamut for that gamma. So that's why we chose those in camera. All right, so let's apply this, and all of a sudden our footage is gonna look a lot more normal. Now, some of you might be asking, why don't you do this on an adjustment layer? Because then when you grade the adjustment layer, like it is here, this adjustment layer, for example, has the grade on it as I toggle that in and out. I'll show you how we get to that point, because yes, technically, let's say that I go ahead and let's take this LUT off. And let's say I graded a similar clip over here, and I can just drag this over, and now all of a sudden my clip is going to be graded. So if you just drag your adjustment layer over, your clip is graded. So some of you might be asking, why aren't you just doing that? I got to get off that frame with my tongue out. But some of you might be asking, why don't you just grade your adjustment layer and start there? And I'm going to show you why I don't do it that way to start. So we go in here, we grab our color correction LUT, bang, now all of a sudden we're working with some footage that looks a little bit more normal. Next thing that I do is I always apply a little bit of an S-curve to all of my footage. I'll come in and tweak this later if I need to, but I just start out very light in that S-curve. Next, I'm going to go over here to my scope. So I'm on my color panel. The way you get your scopes up is that you click that little settings wrench. I have my vector scope, Y, U, V, I always get those wrong, Parade, RGB, and my waveform Luma. So this is up here, this is that one that I always get wrong, the vector scope, YUV. This is an important scope to have up, particularly for skin tones. If you can see this line right here between the yellow and the red, this is our skin tones line. We want our skin tones to land on that line. So how I do that, and this is why I don't edit with adjustment layers to start. I go back into my edits tab and I'm going to draw an opacity mask around some skin. Let's just get some skin, a decent sample size, and as I draw that opacity mask around the skin, everything goes away. If you try to do that on an adjustment layer, that's not what happens. The adjustment layer goes away, but the clip is still there, so you can't get the black screen with just the information. Why is that important? If I go back over here to color, now I've isolated my skin tones and I can look at this line and say, are my skin tones lining up on that? Now I would say in looking at this, they're a little bit on the purple side, which is actually, or the magenta side, which is actually what I like a little bit, because if I pull those over and I can adjust these and pull these a little more green, let's make it near perfect on there. If I bring that over to that green and I take this mask off, I'd say that's too green. I don't like how that's looking. So I'm gonna jump back over here and I'm going to balance that back out to this 0, because again, in camera, this is a 5600 Kelvin shot. I knew the white balance was dialed in camera. I don't have to worry about this correction too much. Now the next thing I want to do is I want my skin to be bouncing between 80 and 90 on this overall exposure scale, which right now, because I exposed it properly with those zebras that we talked about, I'm pretty happy with that exposure. What I could do if I didn't like the exposures, I'd pull the whites up until it got into the 80s and 90s, or if it was overexposed, I would pull that down to where it got a little bit lower. But again, from an exposure perspective, I'm pretty happy with where that's landing. So once that's taken care of, that's how I get my skin tones tint as well as exposure for the most part. I'm going to get rid of that mask because I'm happy with that from here. Now, once I get that done, I'm definitely not going to be changing the white balance from this point on. Next thing I want to do is I want my blacks. If you look at this Lumascope over here, I want my blacks to be just barely at that 0 line. So they're not going to be well below it, which that's actually pretty good. And they're not going to be way too high. I like my blacks to be pretty dark and as close to that 0 line without crushing the information. Information starts getting crushed when you see it disappearing or creating a flat line like that. That's crushed or lost information. So I just want this to sit right at that 0 mark. I'm not super concerned about the stylized look yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. Next piece, like I say, with my whites, I've already taken care of that with my skin tones. I'm not going to touch that. I'll always pull my shadows up a little bit just because I like to have a little more detail in the shadows, and shooting in log, you can get that back, which is nice. Highlights will come down slightly, though I will show you a trick on that in just a moment. Contrast I took care of, and this information spread pretty well. Contrast I took care of with the S-curve. And last piece would be saturation. And if you look here, this is our saturation circle. I don't know what octagon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, hexagon, I think. This is our saturation hexagon, making that up 100%. So we don't want any information to go past that line because it's not actually going to render, and we're just going to lose the information anyway. So typically, and this is just for the sake of this, you would want the saturation to be within that line, but I'm actually going to leave that alone and get to saturation in just a minute. So I'm happy with that. So here's the grade that we applied. There's out of camera, and there's our just basic exposure and color correction, which looks pretty good. What I do next, I hit Command C and jump back to my edits tab here, and this is where I put it on an adjustment layer. So I'm going to bring an adjustment layer in, and then on this adjustment layer I'm just going to right click and click on paste attributes, and I'm going to get rid of everything besides this Lumetri color panel. That's what I copied from the clip, all that work I just did. I'm going to paste it on top of here. It's going to get a little crazy because now I have two of the same grades on there, or color corrections on there rather. So I'm just going to jump back into the original clip, and I'm going to delete my Lumetri color panel. And there we are back to where we were, which is what we want. Now my entire color grade is done on a adjustment layer. So let's say that this was a similar clip over here, and it's not, but I would just drag that over, and now I just color graded that next clip. So that's the speed at which you can get that done. But that's my process, and the reason I do it that way is because I want to be able to do that opacity mask on the actual clip. Next thing, I'm gonna add another adjustment layer on top of this footage, and we're going to stylize it. Here's the LUT that I use. I go back in my color panel, and the LUT that I use is going to be a lens distortions LUT. It's called Monochrome 3. I'll link that below. I'm still way too new to make my own LUTs, maybe someday, so I'm clearly using other people's LUTs here and then making my own tweaks. This is the process that's worked well for me. So tap that on, and you can see that that is already getting a nice and stylized look, and I'm just going to toggle back and forth off of that clip. Now typically with LUTs, you don't want them to be coming in at 100% intensity. These lens distortion LUTs are pretty subtle. They don't come in that hot, as opposed to like literally any other LUT comes in at 100%, like way too hot, and you'd usually dial that back into like this one's pretty hot, but dial that back in like the 30s to get the look that you want, as opposed to that when it comes in pretty strong at 100. These lens distortion ones just don't come in that hot. I mean, I think they're pretty subtle, but I still pull it back around the 80s. It looks pretty good for now. So 75 on that. So once that's applied, the next thing I do, and you can see that I'm just gonna toggle this off. You can see this, if you watch this LumaScope over here, I'm just toggling that's on, that's off, on, off. What I don't like about this LUT is that it does crush some of my blacks. As you can see, those shadows are getting squished down, and even the whites get pulled down as well. And how I counter that is I add a curve panel to this adjustment layer that has that lens distortions LUT. So the one thing that I don't like that it's doing is it's kind of crushing my whites. So I'm gonna bring those whites back, and I also don't like that it's crushing my shadows. So I'm gonna bring those shadows back as well. And that's actually the curve that I'm going to use for this. I know it blew my skin tones out a little bit, but if I toggle back on and off, the change between the two actually came in a little bit hot. I'm going to fix that. But the change between the two isn't nearly the same as it used to be, so I'm just going to pull this back a little bit and get something a little bit closer to where we had it. So now that information changed in that toggle, yeah, I'm good with that. Not much of a change there at all. The other thing this LUT does is it adds a lot of luminance to my skin tone. So I'm gonna go to this hue versus luma. I'm gonna get my color picker. I'm gonna select a skin tone, and it gave me these 3 dots. I want the middle one. I'm just gonna pull that down slightly, and that's gonna drop some luminance out of my skin tone, and you can see the subtle change that's making when I go like this. I would say that probably brought it down a little too much. I look a little bit like some kind of plastic character. So there we go, just like that. And then the other thing is my saturation, my skin tone, I think has been sucked out with this LUT as well. So I'm just gonna grab my skin tone with the color picker the same way. I'm just gonna bring the skin tone up just slightly, and you can see the difference that that's making. It's very subtle, so I'm gonna crank it a little bit further actually. Very subtle difference there. And there we have it. So I would say that this grade, I might spend a little more time tweaking, but I would say that we are all done here. So here's where we started, and then we applied our color correction. We got to that point, and then we got our stylized look, and it's pretty subtle. It cools off some of the shadows, desaturates some of those oranges and greens and yellows, and then we just brought our skin tone back. So I'm pretty happy with that. Could say that the saturation curve over here is blown out, but that is definitely this orange behind me, and I'm good with that. I'm not too concerned about that. It's not a skin tone that's getting blown out. All right, so now we have our fitness clip. So let's take this piece of gear and let's make it look good. Now it's the same process that I just talked about, so we're just gonna run through it pretty quickly here. First thing is we apply that leaming LUT, and we got something that already looks pretty good. Next, from a color correction perspective, I'm gonna bring my blacks down. A lot of information here up top, and I want some deep blacks. So you notice here, like when you do your slider and you push left, you get to -100. If you grab the number and slide left again, you can get even further, which is definitely what I want here. Shadows are gonna bring some of those blacks back as well. Oh, those are white, sorry. Shadows, there we go. That looked weird. Shadows are gonna bring some of those blacks back as well. We actually want some whites to pop. I know I'm losing some information on the top of this Luma scale here with those whites, but I like how this color pop is happening, and I can get some of that detail back when I pop these highlights down a little bit. Forgot to add my curve, which I said was always my first step. So this S curve, and you can see that nice contrast and roll off that that's gonna get. So happy with that. I don't have much else to really do here. I'm just gonna take this same adjustment layer, Option, drag over this adjustment layer, which is the same stylized one I had from earlier, which will likely work well on this clip. There's probably some things with those skin tones that I probably wouldn't want to include, so I'm actually gonna get rid of all those corrections and leave those alone. Even this, I'm not too concerned about that piece from a shadows perspective with this clip, but I have that same look that I had earlier with that 75% intensity, and this one doesn't have skin tone, so I might crank this back to 100. And you can see, like, with that stylized look we're getting, I think that just looks really sharp and clean. So from a starting point perspective, this is where we were, and we added our correction, which already looked pretty good, and then we stylized. So popping out of Premiere, and let's actually put these clips up on screen, because we're looking at them at like half resolution in there. Let's get them back up on screen, full resolution, 4K, fully exported. Take a look at how these clips look. Here we go. So there you have it. That's my entire process for shooting with the Sony a7S III, particularly in SLOG3, for getting this exact look that you are looking at right now. If you have any further questions at all, add them in the comments below. Share your grading process in the comments below. If I got anything wrong or that you would disagree with, share that below too. I want to learn as well. Or if you have suggestions on things you want me to expand upon and really focus in for future videos, let me know again in the comments below. My name is Sean DeWispelaire. This channel is all about the skills behind the art of creativity, and me being full-time in the fitness industry, it's always going to have a bit of a fitness feel to it. So if that's something that you're into, subscribe if you haven't already, tap the thumbs up button if this video gave you any value, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care. See ya.